Funding for Current Conversations is provided by University of Oklahoma President's Office, University of Oklahoma Outreach, and World Literature Today. Welcome to Current Conversations. I'm R.C. Davis-Indiano. Today we have a special compilation show on turmoil in the Middle East and women caught in violent settings. We have with us experts on the Middle East and women in violence, Joshua Landis, Shehata, Jill Irvine, and Nyla Khan. Join us for these fascinating conversations. Joshua Landis is a foremost expert on Syria and the Middle East. I think you'll enjoy these brief but informative few moments with him.
Assad and the Russians have taken the west of the country. You've got the Kurds, 10% of the population, but they've really carved out a long strip along the Turkish border in the north of the country. The United States has helped them. There are various rebel groups. Today, ISIS has a big hunk of that. Federalization is the wrong word. It's partition of Syria along these battle lines. And I think we're going to see them harden. And the attempt now is really to find a truce. That's what Putin and the United States have said they want to do, is to try to get ceasefires along these battle lines and get some kind of accommodation. And that means living with this fragmentation. Now, the hope would be that sometime in the distant future they would reunite, sort of like East Germany, West Germany. But that in order to stop the war, we have to recognize the balance of power the way it is and accept a partition process, a Yugoslavia-type divide-up of Syria.
You said a moment ago that back in time, into the 19th century, early 20th century, the West imposes these nation-state boundaries in a way that made sense to the West but didn't always make sense to the people that are there. Basically, federalization of Syria would recognize that didn't work. Here we are separate communities. The people that have been forced together, do they need to somehow find equilibrium in their own communities? You've used the term the great sorting out. You either drive the people out that you don't want to be with you, or you kill them, or you do something till the people who are left are happy to be with each other. I mean, is that the sort of ugly process that needs to play out?
That is a nation-building process, and we've seen it unfold across Central Europe and Europe. It's brutal. Groups that do not agree are treated as a fifth column, and they're suppressed or they're driven out of the country. And that's what I think is happening in Syria today. How, where the borders, eventual borders, are going to be drawn, whether people can reknit their relationships and live together. And rather than, like a Czechoslovakia, which at least peaceably split, but even after living together for hundreds of years, they could not agree on a common political community. They didn't want to live together. They separated. And that's what's happening with Kurds in Iraq and in Syria. And it may be what's happening between Sunnis and Shiites. We don't know to what extent that's happening.
So a kind of human nature and forces of history finally just resurface, and we're all just kind of knocked back, really. It's a kind of withering thought, and history's just going to have to play out for a while. Then we can come back and maybe find some order in what's left, basically.
And we see that happening in the Arab-Israeli conflict, where the Jews have been kicked out of all of their cities, whether it's Baghdad, Damascus, Aleppo, and they've collected, formed a nation state, and in turn are pushing out Palestinians who've become refugees. Very brutal process of this great sorting out, where the Armenian massacres in Anatolia, where the Turkey just expelled them. There's no more Christians in Turkey. There used to be 20% of Anatolia, of Turkey landmass, was Christian before World War I. They're gone. And that process of this great sorting out, as I've called it, is, I think, very much alive today in the Middle East. And we've seen the Christians of Syria and Iraq almost disappear.
Hasn't the U.S. been historically, in the last, maybe half century, just resistant to that notion that we are going to impose our will in the Middle East? We're going to have democracies that look like us, look like democracy in the U.S., where there just doesn't seem to be any chance that's going to happen. This historical great sorting out is going to happen no matter what we do, and yet the U.S. continues to foster this romantic notion of democracy in places where it doesn't have a chance. I mean, isn't that a pattern?
It is a pattern, and the Middle East has not been fertile ground for that ideology. Now, clearly, Eastern Europe was, and Latin America has been a success. So there are reasons why America clings to this national religion of democracy and spreading democracy around the globe. But America has done that best, it seems to me, when we've allowed other countries to choose it by being an example and a well-working democracy, so that the world has wanted to emulate the United States, which it has done. In the modern period, everybody's wanted to be like America. We had all the wealth, we're going to the moon and so forth. And trying to impose it on the back of a tank has not worked, particularly in regions of the world where you have this ethnic, religious fragmentation. You know, in social sciences, today dominated by this search for what are the prerequisites for democracy? Why is it so difficult to impose democracies on countries like Libya or Syria or Iraq?
So another tension that really people might use to orient themselves is this kind of conflict between the notion of democracy as we conceive it, and then the kind of strongman regime that seems to prevail. There's a taste for it in the Middle East. Putin didn't seem to have to think about it very much at all. When Russia comes into Syria, he's going to be the strong man, empowering somebody else as a strong man. That really might work. I mean, that could actually work there.
You know, you look at Washington and Moscow, and both capitals look at the Middle East and they see the solution is themselves. And they want to emulate their own model and impose it on the Middle East. And Moscow says, America's stupid. The Middle East is not ready for democracy. Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, you constantly try to do the same thing over and over again, impose democracy, tear down these states, these strongmen, and you get chaos and extremism. The Russian example is the right example for the Middle East, which is a strongman like me to rebuild these countries. In a sense, I think that Washington is sitting back on Syria, watching where the Russians go with this, because we've lost confidence in our model, the democratic model, and we're willing to give Putin some time.
Dr. Samer Shehata is a specialist on Egyptian politics and the Middle East. I think you'll learn from his helpful insights about the region.
ISIS isn't the beginning or the end of the story in Egypt. It's not the main story, although an extremist group in the Sinai, which has been operating for a number of years now, really since the uprising against Mubarak in 2011, called Supporters of Jerusalem, in November of 2014 pledged allegiance to the Islamic State and changed their name accordingly. And now they're called Sinai Province, and they undertake a number of terrorist acts in Sinai and elsewhere. But just to put things in perspective a little bit here, we're talking about ISIS and so on. I think it's important to understand a number of things. First is that the only reason really ISIS exists today is as a result and the consequence of the American war on Iraq in 2003. There was no ISIS in Iraq, there was no Al-Qaeda in Iraq and so on, only as a result of the destruction of that regime. And it was a horrific regime, as it were, and the chaos that resulted afterwards. We were very good at regime destruction, but we did a terrible job of trying to put things together again. You'll remember the disbanding of the Iraqi military, the de-Baathification policy, Paul Bremer looking at Iraqi society with the lenses of sectarianism and putting together a governing council based on how many Shia and how many Sunni and Kurds and Turkoman and so on. And out of that chaos developed, of course, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, the Jordanian, and so on. And ISIS, of course, morphed out of Al-Qaeda in Iraq. And many of these people are alum of American prisons.
I was going to say Camp Bucca. I mean, the leadership of ISIS, they were all at Camp Bucca.
And so you can't not really understand ISIS without understanding it, I would argue, as the unintended consequence of American action, the Iraq War, and the consequences of that. And the consequences of that, of course, are also not just chaos and regime breakdown, but the rise of a Shia sectarian regime in Iraq that marginalized and repressed its Sunni population, so much so that ISIS looked good in comparison to Prime Minister Maliki. That's part of it. And the other part of it is you can't understand, I think, the rise of ISIS without understanding the inaction of the United States with regard to Syria. In other words, and the international community, not taking action against this industrial killing machine, which has been in operation since 2011. I think the death count now is well over 200,000, as it were. That has fueled ISIS as well. And in some ways, ISIS and the Assad regime feed off each other. In fact, in some senses, they're mirror images of each other, right? Regimes get the oppositions they deserve. And so it might be the United States' position right now that we're de facto in bed with Assad, as it were, but it's a failed policy. It's the result of not taking decisive action when we should have taken decisive action against the Assad regime earlier.
Could this be one of those cases, though, where the U.S. would have been condemned either way? If they had put boots on the ground in the Middle East, wouldn't that have been a radicalizing gesture that would not have played with a lot
Well,
of...
the problem is that the United States intervened in the Middle East when it shouldn't have intervened in the Middle East, the 2003 Iraq War. And as a result of that, and as a result of the expenditure of blood and treasure in that useless, unnecessary war based on lies, Americans had no appetite when a situation when an intervention could have been, I think, more beneficial, as it were, and more justified, had no appetite to undertake that in the Syrian case.
Could we go back to Egypt for a second,
Certainly.
though? It seems to be a new kind of authoritarianism in Egypt with el-Sisi. And is that a response in some way to a kind of lack of stability in the region? Let's decide who's really in charge in Egypt. How do you read?
Well, that's part of it. I mean, I think across many of the so-called Arab Spring countries, or countries that have experienced uprisings and so on, after 4 years of tumult and uncertainty, an increase in insecurity and a rise of extremism, people are betting on security over democracy.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, the polling data shows that if you look at the polling data 4 years ago, people want democracy very much and so on. Now it seems that they would rather have security, or they prefer security over democracy. That's part of it. I mean, Egypt has experienced, of course, 4 years of tumult since Mr. Mubarak was dethroned in 2011. We've had, I think, 4 presidents, 3 constitutions, 2 presidential elections, and the list goes on. And unfortunately, as you mentioned, we've really seen now, with Mubarak being acquitted and his sons being acquitted, with many of his cabinet members now out and so on, and the revolutionaries in jail, the revolutionaries who protested in 2011 against Mubarak and for freedom and democracy and social justice being repressed, and journalists, we've seen really a 360 turn. And there is a kind of resurgence of authoritarianism in Egypt.
I'm wondering, let's see, the Muslim Brotherhood are outlawed in Egypt now, right? And it seems to me that there's a pretty large voting bloc, almost 28% is the Islamic bloc. How does Egypt, in a way, have the temerity to be so anti-Islamic when the region seems to be, it's an Islamic uprising? How does that work in Egypt?
Well, the uprisings in 2011, interestingly enough, in Syria and Egypt and Tunisia and so on, weren't really Islamist. They weren't. I mean, many of the slogans and the aspirations were liberal and to some extent not so much secular, but not really Islamist. These were not uprisings that were inspired by the Muslim Brotherhood in Syria or the Nahda in Tunisia or the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. These were young people who wanted an end to authoritarian regimes. They didn't want presidents for life. They didn't want the corrupt governments, and they wanted jobs and so on. Islamists are popular, or have some degree of popularity, in many of these countries. And of course, in Egypt, the story is complicated. They were elected. Mr. Morsi was Egypt's first democratically elected civilian president. He had an abysmal presidency, and there were major protests against him at the end of his first year in office. But there were forces working against him as well, and the military being one of them, and other forces that weren't really committed to democracy and so on. So it's a complicated story.
Do you think the judgment is in yet on what el-Sisi is going to do and what that government will accomplish? Because it doesn't seem, what he's done doesn't seem like a power grab of a strong man. You know, there's a new authoritarianism, but it doesn't seem to be built around him.
Well, it's built around the military as an institution to some extent, right? Egypt is what some have called an officers' republic, right? Meaning that the military has a privileged political and economic position. They are not subject to civilian oversight. They operate a very significant economy, which we don't know how large it is, but they produce everything from bottled water to vegetables.
Dr. Jill Irvine does research on women and violence around the world. I think you'll enjoy these few minutes with her.
So 1325, and just to pick up on what Nyla was saying, the U.S. hasn't ratified CEDAW at all, and claiming that it's an infringement on national sovereignty. So one of the very, very few countries that hasn't ratified it. So 1325 was passed in 2000, and it was passed as a result of a very widespread grassroots effort by women's organizations around the world that were then organized at the global level through the UN to bring this to the attention of the Security Council. And it has three main emphases. And the first is prevention, the second is protection, and the third is participation.
So something like pre-conflict, conflict, post-conflict.
Yes, except the prevention really is a sort of a broader notion, and that notion rests on the idea that societies that have gender equality in place are less conflict prone. And so the idea is to really promote gender equality. And so the protection, a portion of this, which comes into play during and after conflict, is the idea, as you were suggesting before, that women need and children also need particular protection from certain kinds of gender-based crime
Are
during
you saying
the war.
that it's not just a matter of shielding women from violence, but getting women involved in leadership?
Absolutely. That is the thrust of 1325.
Okay.
And so the idea is that after the conflict's over, women should be involved in peace agreements, they should be elected to parliament, they should be part of peacekeeping forces, UN peacekeeping forces, and that in this way, their security is protected, particularly post-conflict. And it's important to remember that for many women, the post-conflict period is even more fraught.
Yes.
And so the idea here was, there has been, these famous or infamous, I should say, cases of UN peacekeeping forces getting involved in trafficking and all kinds of all kinds of violence against women. And so the idea is that you really need women involved in the peace-making and peacekeeping process. And then the notion of participation, that they should be elected to parliament. And so 1325, for example, has been used to put electoral quotas into place. And women's organizations have used them quite effectively around the world as a tool, a mechanism for pressuring not only their own governments, but international forces and international peacekeeping or occupation forces.
Now, is this the first UN resolution that calls for the involvement of women in leadership positions? It seems like the things I've read about before really just call for the protection of women. This really goes a step further.
Yes, although I would say CEDAW is also very much focused on promoting women's equality, and some of the platforms that have come out of the global UN conferences on women and the Beijing conference in particular in 1995.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, you've seen some good results of 1325 in the Balkans, right? Could you talk about that?
Sure. Well, first of all, 1325 was applied first in the Balkans, and it really came out of the conflict in the Balkans, which was the point at which it was sort of the flashpoint for women organizing globally against violence against women in conflict zones. And so they were very keen and very organized to apply 1325 in this situation. And so they applied it across the board in all kinds of ways related to getting women in the peace making process. So the idea of getting them involved in the working groups that came out of the conflict that were moving forward in various aspects of rebuilding society. They were very active in pressuring UN forces as well as their own domestic governments to include women in these processes. They were very, very active in trying to get women, for example, and women's organizations working with the military so that they were both their domestic militaries and international forces to make sure that they understood gender-based violence and were on the lookout for it and so on. And then, of course, they were pretty instrumental in bringing to light the trafficking that was going on in the region in which American contractors were centrally involved as well as other forces.
So 1325, I think it's a resolution that I think you like because of the involvement part. But I think, I've read your work on this, you really make a big point of the fact that the implementation of it was what you, I think, call the double boomerang effect,
Right.
was really very smart, where people leveraged the international organization against local forces and then back the other way
Yes.
when they had to. And that's got to be a big part, the smart implementation.
Exactly. This notion of how to leverage, how to use these global norms, and 1325 isn't the only one, to leverage change at home.
Dr. Nyla Khan studies women caught in crises around the world, and I think you'll enjoy these few enlightening moments with her.
Militarized peacekeeping follows closely on the heels of militarized interventions. So the role that women can play by reestablishing their historical link or connection with peacekeeping and peace building needs to be encouraged, needs to be highlighted. And also, as Jill correctly pointed out, unfortunately, in the West, we see a reductive portrayal of Muslim women, a stereotypical portrayal. Muslim women across the globe are reduced to the veil.
Right.
All veiled Muslim women are portrayed as repressed.
Right.
And so the United States, particularly during the Bush era, in order to justify the war on terror and the invasion of Pakistan, that was the rhetoric that was deployed by the United States. And a lot of feminists, particularly third world, developing world feminists, were very critical of the speech made by Laura Bush at the time, because she justified the invasion of Afghanistan by saying that it was for the liberation of the women of Afghanistan.
So the phenomenon you're talking about is really just an extension of what we've always called Orientalism, at least in the modern era, where the West creates a caricature of the East and then responds to the caricature it's created to justify all kinds of things.
And it's a kind of colonial feminism as well, because first world feminists end up reinforcing the binary between the first world and the third world by highlighting the plight of their poor oppressed sisters who require the intervention of the West in order to gain emancipation and empowerment.
Well, how does 1325 play in environments like the one in Kashmir? Is there, I'm suspecting there's probably not one response, there are a number of responses. How is it played?
You know, unfortunately, the United Nations, when it comes to a part of the world like Kashmir, the United Nations hasn't been very effective. It hasn't been very active. And Jill talked about the quotas for women in parliaments as well as legislatures. But we still see in the Indian parliament, well, I will talk specifically about Kashmir. So in the Legislative Assembly of Kashmir, there is a very small number of women legislators. And because they are in a small minority, they are very visible. They get stereotyped very easily. There is that pressure to conform to a militaristic mindset because they don't want to come across as overly soft. And even in this day and age, women in the legislature of Kashmir are relegated to the soft areas of family affairs and social welfare. So we see that kind of stereotyping.
So women are either being forced into mimicking men in a certain way politically, or they're just pushed off into the periphery.
Absolutely. Because of those pressures of high visibility, stereotyping, small numbers. We see that in the United States as well. Women don't want to come across as overly soft, and they don't want to come across as too maternal. So they toe that very masculinist, militaristic mindset and line of thought.
Would there be an interpretation of Sharia law that would protect women, particularly in these conflict environments? Is there a basis for that in Sharia law?
You know, I think it's very important for us to historicize and contextualize religious tenets and religious precepts, not just Islamic, but Christian, Judaic as well. We need to look at the Quran, the Bible, the Torah as historical documents more than anything else. So back in the day when the Quran was revealed, it gave women of that society in Arabia a lot more rights than they had had before Islam was established, before the Quran was revealed. And Sharia law basically has four sources. So the first is the Quran, the second is the Sunnah, which is the prophetic model, actions that were endorsed by the Prophet back in the day. The third is scholarly consensus, and the fourth is analogy. And as I pointed out a little while ago, interpretations of the Sharia differ from one society to the other. Right. And it's very important to look at the situation, at pre-existing conditions, before deciding which law, which ruling can be applied to that particular situation. Also, one thing that I would like to point out is that in a lot of Muslim societies, cultural practices, even pre-Islamic cultural practices, get conflated with Islamic epistemology.
Could you explain that?
For example, there is a practice in, let me give you a couple of concrete examples, clitorectomy that exists in some African countries. Is not an Islamic practice. It is not a practice that is endorsed by the Quran or any other Islamic text or document. That is a pre-Islamic practice that has existed in those societies for a long time, in Egypt as well.
But it gets painted as part of Sharia law in the West.
Absolutely. It gets conflated with Islamic epistemology, and it gets seen as a practice that is endorsed by the representatives of the religion, which is completely incorrect. There is a practice in Pakistan that is called haq bakshish. It exists in a couple of regions of Pakistan, like Sindh and the Punjab, where women of feudal, wealthy families are married to the Quran. And that is in order to keep properties within those wealthy feudal families so that they don't need to distribute or divvy up their possessions. Right. Now, that practice has no basis in Islam. Okay. The only regions in which it exists is Sindh and Punjab in Pakistan. So it's more of an economic, cultural practice.
I see.
Like patriarchy.
That's what we have time for. Thank you so much for being with us. Join us next time for more current conversation. Thank you for watching.